what you've got so far, if I were to try to back out sort of a causal theory, it seems to be embedded sort of in this sentence here. So you say, the public has ideas of what government should be doing, ideas that are grounded not so much in political theory as in habits and practices often supported by institutional arrangements that become self-reinforcing over time. Earlier, you described the way that those institutional arrangements really are more a function of elites' preferences, it sounds like, right? So if you sort of strung those ideas together, you'd say, well, so there are elites who have ideas about what the institutions should look like, and they design the institutions, and then sort of the fiscal culture sort of trickles down from those institutional arrangements. But that doesn't strike me as the only possibility, right? It seems like the process could actually happen precisely in reverse, or some combination of those three steps in different orders. That to me is a really exciting question. How exactly people get that idea, or elites get that idea of what exactly the state ought to be doing. Much more interesting, honestly, than a lot of the institutional stuff, which is grounded, has been covered a lot. So insofar as you're deciding, where to put the emphasis of the future work, I'd put my vote in for that.
Gautam has a three-finger.
and there's this economics literature, by Alessina and Glaser, Alessina and Loreto, Piketty, 1995, in which they talk about where these beliefs come from and how they become self-enforcing. And they're especially interested in institutional variation across the US and Europe. They talk about basically how beliefs about mobility returns to the relative returns to lock-in effort and so forth. And that's more a theory of, I think, the masses than elites, but presumably the elites were at some point masses also.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I'm sorry I didn't begin to respond to it because I was so eager to tell you that this was such a messy paper. So I'm trying to think about how to say this, because we're still really struggling with this. So I think this is a key issue. I think, Rob, you're onto something that both of us do tend to see institutions as largely, not always everywhere, but largely being an effect of some kind of elite bargaining at some crucial founding or refounding moment. Mass preferences may come into play depending on the location. But let me slip into the union story for a minute as an example of where those interactions happen, and then let me get back to the question that you're asking about the fiscal culture and the beliefs. So in the unions that I studied with John, there was a crucial moment when a set of leaders, a leadership cohort, and you can think about this as a revolutionary or state-building process, solve strategic problems, figure out how to create an organization, overcome collective action problems, and at the same time win from employers recognition of the union, collective bargaining rights, and a decent first contract. That gives that initial leadership cohort, the legitimacy, the right, the authority. Again, you can play with the words. But they then form or reform, if it's an older union, a constitution that establishes what kind of union it's going to be. And in our model, there are two kinds of rents that a leader can take, a political rent or an economic rent. And then the institutional arrangements follow from that. So if it's an economic rent, it's an organization where the leadership gets paid a lot and they expect dues and they have to deliver unless they're extremely corrupt, which also can happen. But the ones who are actually meeting some kind of contract with their members will deliver very, very good wages, hours, and benefits to their members in return for the dues, but don't expect them to do anything else. Don't expect them to have any control over much. I mean, there might be democracy, but it's a very thin democracy. It's not a very engaged democracy. It's a vote on the leadership periodically. And the leadership expects to take home a lot of pocket money from the process. If it's political rents, the leadership still has a commitment to delivering the goods and services to the members in return for their dues and their engagement in strikes and other things that you need to do to make changes. But they also create, they want the capacity to be able to persuade members to do other things that are beyond their narrow self-interest. The title of the book is In the Interest of Others. And so they create a different set of institutional arrangements that are much more participatory, hold the leadership much more accountable on an almost day-to-day basis, make it very easy to dismiss the leadership. Major decisions like over a contract or over a decision to close the ports, we were largely studying longshore unions, are made in a democratic way. So if you lose, if you disagree because you're politically on a different, have a different position than the leadership, it's been part of the discussion and you've lost in a way that you can win in the future. I mean, it's got that. But there's also information, there's also capacity to challenge. So we can see from that case, as we can see from nation states or governments generally, that there's a history to these institutions that create a set of institutions that then have a capacity to reproduce themselves, right? There's certain kinds of self-selection processes built in about who will be the succession leadership and who's, like, what kind of normative behavior is expected within that particular set of institutional arrangements. And I do think something like that goes on with a lot of government. And that's part of what initiates a fiscal culture. So again, I'm going to just use the US case as an example, in part because Edgar and I have to write a paper for Boo Rothstein on the United States like in the next month, so we're pulling out US examples like crazy here to see if they work. In the US case, when you think about the establishment of the US, it was there was a kind of anti-tax fiscal culture built into it. It needn't have been, but that was it. Where is Schmuller? I mean, we're talking about the kind of presumption about, I mean, I think the US is a case where there, in practice, where there was a presumption that my property is my property and you have to be, you know, taxes theft unless it's really highly justified. And that's permeated the fiscal culture of the United States. Not that there aren't differences about that within the polity, and not that there aren't conflicts and attempts to change it over time. And in fact, that's what really interested us. You were asking part what really interested us is that dynamic. What causes those? You set this thing in process. What happens? Or is it exogenous shocks? Is it a different kind of rhetoric? Is it a different kind of economy? What is it that new migrants, what is it that makes that change occur? And that's where the population comes in. So you were both concerned about that. You know, part of what's at issue here is we know that different polities tax people in different ways and spend on different parts of the population in different ways. And that gets into something like what we're trying to deal with, bring communities of faith from the union setting into the governmental setting, about who do you feel responsible for. And that can be internationally as well as locally. It could be people, you know, it could be the poor you don't know as well as the poor who your church or your synagogue is supporting and who you might know. It could be Vietnamese peasants who you think you have to fight a war on behalf of. You know, that becomes part of your community fate. So it's a complicated issue, which we're just beginning to disentangle when you pull it out of the very confined area of the union setting. To think about what rhetoric occurs, Aesthetics and Riker's terms. How do you sort of change the debate and what's at stake in the debate at various times so that others are brought into that community of faith or these people are excluded from that community of faith? And what's the consequence of that for policy over time? So that also has effects on beliefs. It also comes from beliefs. It can affect beliefs and come from beliefs. So beliefs is a very important part of the story. It's beliefs about what government should do, what government can do, what we as citizens should do, what we as citizens can be expected to do appropriately, beliefs about what we think the elites should be doing and what they should be spending. And those things I think are subject, you know, we can statically talk about where they come from, and we have a lot of knowledge about that now, particularly over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of good work. You mentioned some, Gautam, but there's been lots of other good work, which we cite in the book. And I'm sure that we missed a bunch on beliefs. But what we don't see a lot of good work on, and I stand to be corrected on this and happily would be corrected on this, is, you know, what changes those beliefs? And that's a little bit what we were trying to do in the interest of others. That one of the consequences of this particular set of institutional arrangements was it allowed leaders and others to influence belief. I'll just end this part with a very quick story from that, which is sort of indicative of what we mean. So John and I were followed out of a meeting with pensioners, old timers, in an Australian in Sydney, who'd been working for the doctors union there, the wharfies. And this guy followed us out and he said, you know, I never liked that communist stuff. I thought Big Jim Healy, who was the head of the union, was fantastic. He won us all this stuff. He was a great orator. He was a really nice man. But every time he started talking about communism, my eyes closed and I thought, what is he talking about? He said, then we had a stop work meeting over lunch one day on the docks, and one of the leadership members came and started telling us about the boats that were docked, that we were supposed to unload, that they were Dutch boats, and that they were taking arms to Indonesia to put down the Indonesian revolution. And he said, that was not fair dinkum. What are they doing shooting up, you know, Indonesian peasants? So I'm not going to, so he got information that changed his beliefs about what he could do as a dock worker, what was going on in the world, first of all. It changed his understanding of the world. And then he had a set of beliefs that had been given him by the dock workers that he could actually act on that. He didn't know that before he became part of that organization. But that whether it would be really an effective action in the long run, they knew they could act on their norms and close down the port and not load those armaments to. So I'm searching for those. Those are the things that really interest me, and I think it applies to the government sphere in ways we haven't adequately explored. Not that no one ever has, but that there's a lot more work to be done.
Chris, you had your hand up.
Chris Price, grad student. So I think it's a really exciting project, and from the first question about the fact that there's the feedback between the government and then the governed, I mean, that makes sense to me. But the question I had is really about, if we kind of expect there's feedback, leaders propagate certain ideas, people have certain ideas, is this just a progressive story where we always kind of start out at the pre-modern and end up at the general fund, you know, the final step? Or is it possible to step back in any of these? So I mean, you know, the example comes up sort of the Reagan Revolution or the 1980s neoliberal revolution. You know, is it possible that we flip back? If so, what does that tell us about the feedback? And is that a way for you to maybe find, you know, sort of disentangle some of these things, look at those moments where you fall backwards rather than stepping forwards?
Yeah, I wouldn't use that particular case for that because we're still in it.
Yeah.
But there are lots of cases from the past. 19th century Britain had a bunch of flips like that. You must know about a lot of them, Steve, in thinking about some of the countries that you've been thinking about. I mean, this is not an unusual thing that you see this 20 years of some kind of view of government, or 30 years, or whatever it is, and then there's something causes it to flip. And I want to understand we know it happens. So I'm not interested in just the comparative statics, but understanding a little more about the dynamics of it, what actually causes that. Flip one way and then flip back another way. So I think, yes, that is, I mean, that's the kind, we're going to be looking for cases where you can see that kind of variation over time in a particular country. And also try to figure out whether, you know, there's sort of neighborhood effects.
Jimmy?
Right, so my name is Timmy. So I think in a way you can answer what was my first question, which was when you describe what communities of faith are, there's this sense that they are finding people or bringing together a group of people that identify in some dimension as being similar, and that comes out strongly from the text. But I think from what you've discussed now, it's also about interdependencies, and people think that, you know, we have this sort of bound faith, and I think that comes across less clearly. So I was thinking of the case of like welfare policy someone thinks that, well, maybe we should provide some degree of welfare